All right, you can see the second learning target deals with river valley civilizations. We're going to answer these two essential questions. How did the geography affect them? And what were the political and technological advances that they made? First, we got to know where these river valley civilizations are. One was right here in the Nile River. The first one we're going to talk about was here in Mesopotamia, or the Tigris and Euphrates River. The third is in the Indus Valley, where the Indus River and Ganges River are. And the last is over here in China, which is the Yellow River or Wang He River was. First, we're going to look at is Mesopotamia, or the land between two rivers, known as the Fertile Crescent. It was an arc of land between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, and the land between two rivers, otherwise known as Mesopotamia, was a fertile plain of land between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates would flood each year unpredictably and leave soil in which they used to create their crops. They had three problems here. Floods were unpredictable. Sometimes there was no rain. The land offered no barriers to protect them from outside invasion. And the last problem was the land had very few natural resources, such as wood, stone, etc. But because they had food, they were able to trade for those things later on. The Sumerians worked together to find solutions to these problems. They built irrigation systems that would take water from the rivers to their fields. They used the dried mud to create bricks, to build walls for defense systems. And like I said, they used the excess food that they produced in order to trade for wood, metal, etc. They also had organization, leadership, and laws that started to show up within their civilizations. The Sumerians, by about 3000 BC, the Sumerians built cities surrounded by fields of crops. Each of these was known as a city-state, or an independent political unit. See, some of the Sumerian city-states are listed here. Each city-state had a temple which showed religion, and a ziggurat. The priests would appeal to the gods to protect the cities. Sumer's early governments were controlled by the priests. Some military leaders became rulers, and dynasties were formed. A dynasty is a series of rulers from a single family. It was passed down from generation to generation on who would be the dynasties, etc. By 2500 BC, many of the city-states were located along the Fertile Crescent. The Sumerians would exchange products and ideas with various cultures. We refer to this as cultural diffusion, the process of one culture spreading to others. They were polytheistic, which means they believed in many gods. Gods were thought to control the forces of nature, and therefore they wanted to please the gods. They behave as humans do, but people were God's servants. Life after death was considered bleak and gloomy, and so they tried to take advantage of getting the gods to perform things to help their society grow. They had social classes. Kings, landholders, and priests were at the top. Wealthy merchants were next, and at the lowest portion were the slaves. Women had many rights. They could become priests, merchants, and artisans, and they were unlike other cultures. The Sumerians invented the wheel, the sail, the plow. They were the first to use bronze in the Bronze Age. They had advancements in arithmetic and geometry. They used the arch, the column, the ramp, and pyramids for buildings. They established the first system of writing called cuneiform, a wedge-shaped writing, and they studied astronomy, chemistry, and medicine. From 3000 to 2000 BC, they were at constant warfare because of their lack of protection. Centuries of fighting between the city-states made it very weak, and in 23 BC, Sargon of Akkad defeated the city-states of Sumer, creating the first empire, which were an empire as independent states under the control of one ruler. His dynasty lasted for about 200 years. The Amorites, a nomadic group of warriors, took control of the region about 2000 BC. They made Babylon on the Euphrates River the capital, and they were led by a guy by the name of Hammurabi. Hammurabi is most famous for his code of laws, 282 laws that dealt with all aspects of life. They were engraved in stone for everyone to see, made public. Everyone knew what the rules were, the laws were. They varied based on social status, and the government's goal was to take responsibility for order and justice. The Fertile Crescent came to an end 200 years. The Amorite rule in the Fertile Crescent came to an end about 200 years after Hammurabi passed. So this leads us now into the Nile River Valley. The pyramids of the Nile, as you can see, had magnificent monuments and buildings such as the Sphinx and the Pyramid. The Egyptian settlements arose along the 4,100-mile-long Nile River on a narrow strip of fertile land in which silt was left from the Nile. Silt was fertile mud deposits. Farmers would irrigate the land, use irrigation systems to grow wheat and barley, and the Nile, the Egyptians worshipped it as a god in itself. For many centuries, light floods reduced crops, caused some starvation. Heavy floods would destroy property, isolate the region because of the deserts, and protect the Egyptians. So they had a natural protective barrier. Egypt was divided into Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. You can see the definition for the Upper Egypt was from the first set of cataracts, which was a churning rapids, basically. It goes now all the way up to the Nile Delta. The river north, including the Nile Delta, became known as Lower Egypt. The delta is a triangular shape that is formed by silt deposits at the mouth of the river. Villages of Egypt were ruled by two kingdoms, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. The king Namur united the two and made the capital of Egypt Memphis. He established the first Egyptian dynasty here and ruled as what we call a pharaoh. A pharaoh is an Egyptian king-like god or godlike king. Pharaohs controlled religion, government, army, well-being of the kingdom, and we refer to this as a type of theocracy, a religious or a government based upon religious authority. The Egyptians believed in many gods. They believed in the eternal life force called the Ka. The pharaohs felt as if they were a god in themselves. They developed tombs, pyramids, for them to house their stuff in. The pyramids were made of limestone blocks. The kingdoms had leadership, government, and were economically strong. They had over 2,000 gods and goddesses, thus they were polytheistic. They believed in an afterlife. They believed in that your deeds determine where you would go in your afterlife, and thus mummification was a valuable piece of their death rituals, so to speak. They would mummify the bodies to keep the body from decaying. The pharaoh and the family were at the top of their Egyptian social status. Below them were the people of wealth who owned the large amounts of land, the priests and members of government and the army. Then came the middle class, merchants and people that worked in various crafts, and at the bottom were the peasants. Egyptians later would have slaves. People could move from one class of society to another, and those who could read and write held important positions. They also had their own form of writing, hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics used pictures to represent ideas. Originally they were made on clay tablets, but eventually they developed what we called from papyrus plants, we refer to today as paper. They had their own calendar that had 12 months. Each month had 30 days. They developed a system of writing, and they used a form of geometry. Their engineers and architects were very prevalent, as in the Sphinx and the pyramids that we saw earlier. They also were famous for their medicine. The pharaoh's power began to decline about 2180 BC, which brought an end to the Old Kingdom. A Middle Kingdom arose. Some pharaohs regained control. They improved trade. They dug a canal from the Nile River to the Red Sea to drain the swamps from the farms. Eventually, the Hyksos moved into Egypt from Palestine, and they ruled from 630 to 1523 BC. This leads us into the Indus River in South Asia, modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. India was known as the Indian subcontinent, a landmass that included these areas below the largest mountain range that separated from the rest of Asia. As you can see, the mountains to the north, the desert to the east would protect them from invasion. Southern India was a dry plateau flanked by mountains. A narrow strip of tropical land along the coast also existed. Monsoons were seasonal winds that dominated India's climate. The winter, they were dry. In the summer, they would bring rain, causing floods. These floods made the Indus River unpredictable, and the river could change its course. Rainfall, being unpredictable, also brought droughts as well as floods. They were influenced by an area larger than Mesopotamia or Egypt. Early on, there's evidence of agriculture and domestication of animals, and by the 3200s, people lived in farming villages along the Indus River. People built cities laid out in a grid system. Some of these streets were as much as wide as 30 feet wide. Engineers created plumbing and sewer systems within these cities, the first of these being the city of Harappa, known as the Harappan civilization. They built the city on mud brick platform to protect against the floods. They had brick walls that protected the city and the area known as the citadel, or the center of the city in which all the important buildings lie. Lanes separated rows of houses, which featured bathrooms, which this was the first time we'd seen bathrooms in civilizations. Their language, including a system of 400 symbols that has never been deciphered. Scientists can't decipher it. Harappan cities appeared uniform, no great social division. Animals were important to their culture and suggested they had forms of prosperity because they had various types of toys that kids could play with. Finally, they had the role of religion. Priests closely were linked to the ruler. They had a thriving trade with other areas such as Mesopotamia. This leads us to the decline that took place when the Aryans took over around 1500 BC. Next is China. They were isolated from the rest of the world by the mountains, the ocean, and deserts. The Yellow River was a primary river system. It would flood and devour whole villages. They had to be very self-sufficient. The first dynasties occurred in between 1700 and 1027 BC. They were the first to leave any kind of written record. Their cities were built of wood. They had upper class lived within the city and the poor lived outside. The Shang cities had massive walls that they used for military defense purposes. Their civilization centered around the family. The family was a center social institution. They used what they called filial piety. Elder males controlled the family property. The women were expected to obey all men, including the sons. The king and warrior nobles led the society and owned all the land. They used oracle bones as part of their religious beliefs to consult the gods. They also had to develop a system of writing called pictographs or pictograms. There were huge numbers. Each character stood for syllables, not ideas. The Zhaos took control in 1027, and they instituted what they called a dynastic cycle, a pattern of the rise and decline of dynasties. They believed that their power came from the mandate of heaven, which the divine approval gave them their power. This led to feudalism, a system where kings would give land to nobles in exchange for services, and we'll talk more about that later on as we go. The Zhou, it's called Zhou. The Zhou dynasty built roads, canals to improve transportation. They coined money. They produced iron tools and weapons, which led to increase in food production. The Zhou Empire ruled from 1027 to 256. Later, the capital was destroyed by internal wars and traditions. This brings an end to our learning target. You'll get more information from your textbook.